I held the small velvet box in my hands and said, "I practiced this speech for weeks." She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just said, "I know." I opened the box and said, "I don't have much, but I have you." She stared at the ring and whispered, "You always say that." I said, "Because it's true." She exhaled slowly and said, "I need you to listen." I nodded and said, "I'm listening." She pushed the box back toward me and said, "I can't accept this." I laughed once and said, "That's a joke, right?" She shook her head and said, "I wish it was." I felt my chest tighten and said, "We set the date." She replied, "I know." I said, "We told our families." She answered, "I know." I said, "You said yes." She looked down and said, "I was trying to believe it." I swallowed and said, "Believe what?" She hesitated and said, "That love would be enough." I said, "It is enough." She finally looked at me and said, "For you?" I asked, "And not for you?" She pressed her lips together and said, "I'm tired of struggling." I said, "We're building something." She replied, "We're barely surviving." I said, "We get by." She said, "I don't want to get by forever." I asked, "Since when?" She answered, "Since I realized I had options." I felt something break and said, "Options like what?" She stood up and said, "Someone who can give me security." I stood too and said, "I work every day." She said, "I know you do." I said, "I would give you everything." She said, "I don't want everything later." I asked, "So this is about money?" She looked away and said, "It's about stability." I laughed bitterly and said, "That's the same thing." She replied, "It isn't to me." I said, "Is there someone else?" She went quiet. I stepped closer and said, "Answer me." She said, "Yes." I felt my throat burn and said, "How long?" She said, "Long enough." I asked, "Do I know him?" She said, "That doesn't matter." I said, "It matters to me." She shook her head and said, "Please don't ask." I said, "You're choosing him." She whispered, "I'm choosing a future." I said, "I thought that was me." She said, "You're a part of my past." Those words landed harder than anything before. I sat down and said, "So all those nights meant nothing?" She said, "They meant something." I asked, "Just not enough?" She nodded and said, "I'm sorry." I said, "Sorry doesn't feel real right now." She said, "I never meant to hurt you." I replied, "But you did." She said, "I didn't plan it this way." I said, "You planned it enough." I stood and said, "Say his name." She said, "I won't." I asked, "Why?" She answered, "Because it would make it worse." I said, "It's already unbearable." She said, "Please." I looked at the ring and said, "Was any of this real?" She said, "At the beginning." I laughed again and said, "That's cruel." She said, "I know." I asked, "When did you stop loving me?" She said, "I don't know." I said, "I do." She looked confused. I said, "It was when you stopped fighting with me." She stayed silent. I said, "You checked out months ago." She whispered, "I was scared." I asked, "Of me?" She said, "Of staying poor." That word cut deeper than any insult. I said, "So I'm a mistake?" She said, "No." I replied, "Then what am I?" She said, "A lesson." I nodded slowly and said, "Lessons usually cost something." She said, "I lost you." I said, "You gave me up." She reached for me and said, "Please don't hate me." I stepped back and said, "I don't know what I feel." She said, "I never wanted to humiliate you." I said, "Yet here we are." I picked up the box and said, "Keep the ring." She shook her head and said, "I can't." I closed the box and said, "Then it's over." She said, "It's been over." That hurt more than the ring ever could. I walked to the door and said, "I hope he's worth it." She didn't answer. I opened the door and said, "I hope he gives you everything." She whispered my name. I paused but didn't turn around. I said, You don't get to call me anymore. I stepped outside and closed the door. The hallway felt colder than the room. I walked away replaying every word she said. I realized love wasn't what I lost. I lost the version of myself who believed it was enough. I walked down the stairs and heard my phone buzz. It was her mother calling. I answered and said, "Hello." She said, "Did she tell you?" I said, "Yes." She sighed and said, "I didn't raise her this way." I said, "It's not your fault." She said, "You were good to her." I replied, "That wasn't enough." She said, "Sometimes goodness scares people." I said, "She didn't look scared." She said, "She's chasing comfort." I hung up and sat on the curb. I said to myself, "Get up." I didn't move. A passerby asked, "You okay, man?" I said, "I will be." He nodded and walked away. I remembered the night I bought the ring. The clerk asked, "Is she worth it?" I said, "She's everything." I wondered when everything became nothing. My phone buzzed again. It was her. She texted, "Please don't block me." I typed, "Why?" She replied, "I don't want to lose you completely." I typed, "You already did." She wrote, "I still care." I typed, "Care doesn't leave like this." She said, "You're being unfair." I typed, "You're being honest too late." She stopped replying. I stared at the screen until it went dark. I stood up and started walking. Each step felt heavier than the last. I passed the cafe where we planned our future. I heard her voice in my head saying, "One day." I whispered, "That day died." People stared, but I didn't care. I reached my apartment and unlocked the door. The silence hit me immediately. I said, "I'm home," out of habit. No one answered. I sat on the floor and opened the box again. The ring reflected light I didn't feel. I said, "You deserved better." I didn't know if I meant her or me. I remembered her laughter. I remembered her promises. I said, "Which ones were lies?" The room didn't answer. I lay back and closed my eyes. Her voice kept repeating, "You're a lesson. You're my past." I said, "I didn't agree to this." I felt tears but didn't wipe them. I stood up and went to the mirror. I asked, "Who are you now?" I didn't recognize the man staring back. I said, "Get used to this face." I placed the ring on the table. I said, "You don't own me." My phone buzzed again. Another message from her. "I'm sorry," she wrote. I didn't reply. I turned the phone face down. I said, "This is where it ends." I lay in bed fully dressed. The ceiling felt too close. I said, "Tomorrow I survive." My voice sounded empty. Sleep didn't come easily. Her words echoed louder than my thoughts. When morning finally arrived, I knew one thing. My old life was gone forever. I got up and brewed coffee I didn't drink. I said, "Routine is a lie." I checked my bank account. I laughed and said, "Figures." I remembered her saying, "Security matters." I replied aloud, "So did I." I grabbed my jacket and headed out. The city felt indifferent. I said, "You didn't break me." The words felt untrue. I passed a jewelry store window. I turned away quickly. I whispered, "Never again." The promise felt fragile. I walked until my legs hurt. Pain was easier than thinking. I said, "This is the bottom." I hoped I was right. I stopped at a corner and breathed deeply. I said, "You survived the first night." A voice inside answered, "Barely." I nodded and said, "That's enough." I walked forward without looking back. Every step hurt. Every step mattered. I promised myself I would not beg again, not for love, not for closure, not for someone who already chose to leave forever this time. Finally, I woke up and said, "This can't be real." The room stayed silent. I checked my phone and said, "Yesterday happened." No new messages. I sat up and said, "You didn't even say his name." That detail wouldn't leave me alone. At work, my coworker Mark asked, "You look wrecked." I said, "I didn't sleep." He said, Bad breakup. I replied, she chose someone else. Mark said, damn. I said, she wouldn't name him. He frowned and said, that's strange. I nodded and said, it feels intentional. Mark asked, you think you know him? I said, I think I'm supposed to. He leaned back and said, that's rough. I said, it gets worse. Mark asked, how? I said, I keep replaying everything. He said, like what? I said, every time she cancelled plans. Mark said, people do that. I replied, not like she did. I said, she stopped arguing with me. Mark said, that's usually a sign. I said, I thought it meant peace. He said, sometimes it means goodbye. I stared at my screen and said, she checked out early. Mark nodded and said, sounds like it. I said, she was already gone. Mark asked, then why stay? I said, because I was convenient. Mark didn't argue. Later, my manager Sarah called me in. She said, you missed 2 deadlines. I said, I'm sorry. She asked, personal issues? I said, my fiancé left me. She paused and said, that explains it. I added, for someone richer. She sighed and said, I've seen that before. I asked, did they regret it? She said, eventually. I said, that doesn't help. She said, it might later. At lunch, I sat alone and said, say his name. No answer. I scrolled through old photos. I said, you were already smiling differently. A notification popped up. It was a tagged photo. I said, that's odd. I opened it. My heart dropped. I said, I know that building. It was a private club downtown. I said, she never liked that place. Then I saw him. I whispered, no. He stood in the background. I said, I've seen you before. I zoomed in and said, you work with my boss. My hands shook. I said, you're quiet. I remembered him saying nothing at events. I said, you always watched. The pieces started connecting. Mark walked by and said, you okay? I showed him the photo. He said, that guy. I nodded and said, that's him. Mark said, he's loaded. I replied, he's also careful. Mark said, how do you know? I said, he never posts. Mark said, smart. I said, or hiding. I stood up and said, I need answers. Mark said, think first. I said, I already did. I left early. I texted her and wrote, we need to talk. She replied, about what? I typed, you know. She didn't respond. I drove to her apartment and said, don't do this. She opened the door slowly. She said, you shouldn't be here. I said, you owe me honesty. She crossed her arms and said, I told you enough. I said, you avoided his name. She said, because it doesn't matter. I said, it matters because I know him. Her face changed. I said, that confirms it. She said, please don't start. I said, you started months ago. She said, you don't understand. I said, then explain. She shook her head and said, I won't. I said, because you can't. She said, he didn't want drama. I said, so I'm drama now? She said, this is why. I said, you're blaming me. She said, I'm protecting myself. I said, by lying. She said, by surviving. That word again. I said, how long? She whispered, before the proposal. I stepped back and said, so the ring was fake. She said, I wanted it to feel real. I laughed and said, that's disgusting. She flinched. She said, he didn't plan to take you seriously. I said, yet you let me. She said, I was scared. I said, of losing him? She said, of losing security. I nodded and said, you rehearsed this. She said, I didn't mean to fall. I said, you fell quietly. She said, he said not to hurt you. I said, So you stabbed slowly. She said, "You're being cruel." I said, "You taught me." She asked, "What do you want?" I said, "The truth." She said, "He won't choose me." I said, "Then why choose him?" She said, "Because maybe." I said, "Maybe is expensive." She said, "You wouldn't understand." I said, "I understand enough." She reached for me and said, "Don't hate me." I stepped away and said, "I don't hate you." She asked, "Then what?" I said, "I see you." She said, "That's worse." I nodded and said, "It should be." I turned to leave. She said, "He's nothing like you." I stopped and said, "That's obvious." I walked out. Outside I said, "He hides." I said, "He lets others take the fall." I sat in my car and said, "This wasn't sudden. Everything aligned." I said, "You waited until I proposed." The cruelty settled in. My phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. It said, "Leave her alone." I stared and said, "So you do speak?" I typed, "You won't answer me?" No reply. I laughed and said, "Coward." I deleted the message. I drove home and said, "Revenge feels easy." I shook my head. I said, "Easy doesn't last." I remembered her fear. I said, "I won't beg." I parked and went inside. I sat on the couch and said, "Survive first." The anger cooled slightly. I said, "Clarity hurts more than rage." I breathed slowly. I said, "He took nothing from me." I paused. I corrected myself and said, "He revealed everything." That felt true. I looked at my hands and said, "I'm still here." The room agreed with silence. I stood and said, "This isn't revenge." I grabbed water. I said, "This is endurance." My voice sounded steadier. I checked my phone one last time. No messages. I smiled faintly and said, "Good." I turned it off. I lay down and said, "Tomorrow changes." The ceiling didn't argue. I closed my eyes and said, "I choose survival." For the first time, it felt real. I saw her by accident and said, "This can't be real." She looked up and said, "You're blocking the doorway." I stepped aside and said, "Sorry." She studied me and said, "You're him." I frowned and said, "I'm who?" She replied, "The man she wouldn't stop talking about." I felt tension rise and said, "You know me?" She nodded and said, "Enough." I said, "Then you know why I'm surprised." She said, "I know why you're hurt." I crossed my arms and said, "Do you?" She said, "Better than you think." I said, "You're his sister." She corrected me and said, "I'm the person who cleans up after him." I asked, "Why talk to me?" She said, "Because you deserve the truth." I laughed quietly and said, "Everyone says that." She replied, "Most people lie." I said, "Are you lying?" She said, "No." I hesitated and said, "Then talk." She gestured to a chair and said, "Sit." I sat and said, "I'm not here to beg." She said, "Good." I said, "I'm not here for revenge." She said, "Even better." I asked, "Then why am I here?" She said, "Because you're ready to listen." I scoffed and said, "I've been listening too much." She replied, "You've been listening to the wrong person." I said, "She told me enough." She shook her head and said, "She told you what she needed to believe." I leaned forward and said, "You're defending him." She said, "I'm explaining him." I said, "I don't care who he is." She said, "You should." I asked, "Why?" She said, "Because he never planned to marry her." The words hit hard. I said, "Say that again." She repeated, "He never planned to marry her." I laughed bitterly and said, "Then why lead her on?" She said, "He didn't." I snapped, "That's a lie." She remained calm and said, "She chased an idea." I said, "He let her." She replied, "He never promised her anything." I said, "Silence is a promise." She shook her head and said, "Silence is avoidance." I rubbed my temples and said, "So I was just collateral." She said, "No." I said, "Then what was I?" She said, "A mirror." I frowned and said, "That makes no sense." She said, "She saw what she lacked when she saw you." I said, "Love." She said, "Conviction." I leaned back and said, "You speak like you know her." She said, "I watched her closely." I asked, "Did you warn her?" She said, "I warned him." I said, "And?" She said, "He ignored me." I laughed and said, "That fits." She replied, "He avoids conflict." I said, "So do cowards." She said, "Or careful men." I said, "Which is he?" She said, "Both." I exhaled and said, "She destroyed us for nothing." She said, "She destroyed you because she didn't know herself." I snapped, "Stop excusing her." She replied, "I'm not." I said, "Then stop softening it." She said, "Pain doesn't need sharpening." I looked away and said, "You don't know what I lost." She said, "You lost an illusion." I laughed sharply and said, "That illusion mattered." She nodded and said, "I know." I asked, "Why meet me?" She said, "Because you're standing at a crossroads." I said, "I'm standing in ruins." She said, "Same thing." I clenched my jaw and said, "What do you want from me?" She said, "Nothing." I said, "Then why help?" She said, "Because I respect men who don't collapse." I scoffed and said, "I'm barely standing." She said, "Yet you're still standing." I said, "Barely." She replied, "Barely is enough to rebuild." I stayed silent. She said, "You think he won?" I said, "He took everything." She said, "He took nothing you should keep." I said, "My future." She said, "That future was borrowed." I looked at her and said, "You're cruel." She smiled slightly and said, "I'm honest." I said, "Why aren't you angry with him?" She said, "Because anger feeds him." I said, "So you just watch?" She said, "I observe." I asked, "And what do you see?" She said, "A man afraid of attachment." I said, "Then why chase her?" She said, "He didn't chase." I said, "He accepted." She said, "Out of convenience." I laughed softly and said, "That sounds familiar." She nodded and said, "It should." I said, "So she left me for a man who won't commit?" She said, "Yes." I said, "That's poetic." She replied, "It's tragic." I said, "She'll regret it." She said, "Eventually." I asked, "And him?" She said, "He always does." I leaned forward and said, "You're telling me this to hurt me." She said, "I'm telling you to free you." I said, "From what?" She said, "The need to compete." I said, "I already lost." She said, "You exited." I frowned and said, "That's different." She said, "Only in pride." I said, "What do you want me to do?" She said, "Nothing reckless." I said, "I'm not planning revenge." She said, "Good." I said, "I'm planning survival." She nodded and said, "Better." I asked, "Why do you care?" She said, "Because broken men become dangerous." I said, "To whom?" She said, "To themselves." I looked down and said, "I feel empty." She said, "Emptiness is space." I said, "For what?" She said, "Growth." I laughed quietly and said, "You sound rehearsed." She said, "I've watched many men fall." I asked, "And?" She said, "The ones who listen rise." I said, "You think I'll rise?" She said, "If you stop bleeding publicly." I said, "I don't show it." She said, "Pain leaks." I said, "What would you do?" She said, "Disappear briefly." I said, "And then?" She said, "Reappear different." I nodded slowly and said, "That's dangerous." She said, "So is stagnation." I stood and said, "This conversation changed things." She said, "Good." I said, "I don't trust you." She said, "You shouldn't." I said, "Yet I believe you." She said, "That's enough." I walked toward the door and said, Will I see you again? She said, if you choose wisely. I paused and said, you're not what I expected. She said, neither are you. I stepped outside and said, she never knew him. The realization settled slowly. I said, she chased shadows. My voice steadied. I said, I chased approval. That hurt more. I breathed deeply and said, this ends differently. The idea formed quietly. I said, not revenge. I shook my head. I said, reinvention. The word felt heavy. I walked forward and said, I won't explain myself anymore. That felt powerful. I said, I'll rebuild in silence. The city didn't object. I said, let them wonder. My steps felt lighter. I said, transformation scares liars. That felt true. I smiled faintly and said, this is only beginning. I stopped checking my phone every minute and said, this is progress. The silence no longer scared me. At work, Mark said, you look different. I said, I feel quieter. He asked, good quiet or bad quiet? I replied, stable quiet. He smiled and said, that's rare. I said, so was my patience. Weeks passed. I didn't announce anything. My manager Sarah said, you've been consistent. I answered, I learned the cost of distraction. She said, promotion season is coming. I said, I'm not chasing anything. She replied, that's usually when people win. I nodded. One night, Mark said, she's asking about you. I said, who? He said, your ex. I replied, I assumed she would. He asked, do you care? I said, I notice. Mark said, that sounds dangerous. I said, it's controlled. He leaned closer and said, she looks stressed. I said, life caught up. Mark asked, you going to talk to her? I said, only if necessary. Days later, my phone buzzed. Her name appeared. She texted, can we talk? I stared and said, this is expected. I replied, what do you need? She typed, closure. I said aloud, closure is expensive. I typed, meet me tomorrow. She responded immediately. That confirmed everything. At the cafe, she said, you look calm. I said, you look tired. She forced a smile and said, life's been busy. I replied, so I heard. She asked, from who? I said, people talk. She sighed and said, he's been distant. I said, that was always his nature. She asked, you knew? I said, I learned. She leaned forward and said, he won't commit. I replied, you chose him anyway. She said, I thought he would change. I said, people rarely do. She whispered, I was wrong. I said, you were hopeful. She asked, why aren't you angry? I said, anger requires investment. She said, I deserve it. I said, that's not my job. She looked down and said, he stopped calling. I replied, silence is his language. She said, he said he wasn't ready. I said, he never would be. She asked, did you know him that well? I said, I watched from the outside. She said, I ruined everything. I said, you redirected it. She looked up and said, I miss you. I said, I miss who I was. She reached for my hand. I pulled back. She said, I thought money meant safety. I replied, safety isn't purchased. She said, I was scared. I said, fear makes loud promises. She asked, do you still love me? I paused. I said, I respect what we had. She said, that's not an answer. I replied, it's the only honest one. She started crying and said, he never loved me. I said, he loved control. She asked, then why did he leave? I said, control gets bored. She wiped her eyes and said, I feel stupid. I said, you feel human. She whispered, I lost you. I said, you let go. She said, I didn't think you'd survive. I smiled faintly. I said, neither did I. That surprised her. She asked, "Are you happier?" I said, "I'm steadier." She said, "That sounds lonely." I said, "Loneliness taught me discipline." She asked, "Could we try again?" I looked at her. I said, "You're asking the wrong man." She said, "I don't understand." I replied, "He doesn't need convincing." She said, "I made a mistake." I said, "Mistakes change directions." She said, "I'd do anything." I said, "That's what scares me." She asked, "Why?" I said, "Because you didn't before." She went quiet. That was answer enough. She said, "He stopped responding." I replied, "That's his exit." She asked, "Did he ever mention me?" I said, "Never by name." She flinched. I didn't soften it. She said, "I was invisible." I said, "You were convenient." She whispered, "I gave up real love." I said, "You postponed self-knowledge." She looked at me and said, "You're different." I replied, "Pain reorganized me." She said, "I hate myself." I said, "That passes." She asked, "Will regret pass?" I said, "Regret matures." She said, "You sound cold." I replied, "I sound healed." She reached into her bag and said, "I kept this." She placed the ring on the table. I said, "You should sell it." She asked, "You don't want it back?" I said, "It already did its job." She said, "What job?" I replied, "It showed me the truth." She stared at the ring and said, "I thought I was choosing power." I said, "You chose appearance." She asked, "Do you think I'll be okay?" I said, "Eventually." She asked, "Without you?" I said, "Especially without me." She laughed sadly and said, "That hurts." I said, "So did silence." She stood and said, "He won't answer my calls." I said, "He never answered emotionally." She asked, "Why didn't you fight harder?" I said, "I fought honestly." She said, "That wasn't enough." I said, "It was everything." She whispered, "I see that now." I nodded. She said, "You were my safety." I replied, "Too late." She asked, "Can we at least talk sometimes?" I said, "That would confuse us both." She said, "You're choosing peace." I said, "For the first time." She looked at me and said, "I envy you." I replied, "I earned this calm." She turned to leave and said, "I hope you're happy." I said, "I'm becoming." She paused and said, "He was never serious." I said, "I know." She asked, "How?" I said, "Serious men don't hide." She nodded slowly and said, "I chased shadows." I said, "We all do once." She left without looking back. I stayed seated. Mark texted, "How'd it go?" I replied, "As expected." He wrote, "Any drama?" I typed, "Just clarity." I paid the bill and stood. My hands didn't shake. Outside, I said, "This is what victory feels like." No fireworks. I said, "Just silence. The good kind." I walked home and said, "Revenge would have been louder." I shook my head. I said, "Peace lasts longer." That mattered. At home, my phone buzzed once more. An unknown number. The message said, "I'm stepping away." I knew who it was. I didn't reply. I deleted it. I said, "He finally chose distance." That sealed it. I sat on the couch and said, "She'll understand soon." "Not today." I said, "Love doesn't hide." That truth settled deep. I turned off my phone and said, "This chapter closes." The room agreed. I lay down and said, "Karma doesn't rush." I smiled. I whispered, "It arrives prepared." I stood at the window and said, "I never imagined calm would feel like this." She smiled and said, "That's how you know it's real." I adjusted my jacket and said, "You don't look nervous." She replied, "I already chose you." I laughed and said, "That helps." She said, "You helped first." I looked at her and said, "You stayed when I was quiet." She answered, "You stayed honest." I said, I didn't have much to offer. She said, you offered truth. I took her hands and said, I'm not afraid today. She said, neither am I. The officiant asked, are you ready? I said, I am. He looked at her. She said, always. Before the vows, I whispered, thank you for seeing me. She whispered back, thank you for becoming you. The officiant said, speak from the heart. I said, I learned the heart needs courage. I said, I was broken and loud once. She squeezed my hand. I continued, you met me when I stopped performing. She nodded. I said, you never asked me to prove anything. She smiled softly. I said, I promise presence, not perfection. She said, that's all I need. She spoke next and said, I watched you rebuild quietly. I listened. She said, you never blamed the world. I felt seen. She said, I choose the man who chose growth. I swallowed hard. The officiant said, do you accept? I said, I do. She said, I do. Applause followed. As we stepped aside, Mark whispered, you look free. I said, I am. Sarah said, you earned this. I replied, we did. Then I saw her. My ex stood near the door. She hesitated and said, can I speak to you? I looked at my wife. She nodded and said, I'll be right here. That mattered. I walked over and said, you look different. She said, so do you. I said, what do you need? She replied, to apologize. I waited. She said, I was wrong. I said, I know. She said, I didn't understand love. I replied, most people learn late. She nodded. She said, I chased noise. I said, I chose silence. She said, he left without explanation. I answered, that was his pattern. She said, I see that now. I said, that's growth. She asked, do you hate me? I said, no. She looked surprised. I said, I outgrew the pain. She whispered, you look happy. I said, I feel steady. She said, I'm glad you found her. I said, so am I. She hesitated and said, I'm sorry for the damage. I replied, it built something better. She said, you don't resent me? I said, resentment is heavy. She nodded and said, I won't stay long. I said, take care of yourself. She smiled sadly and said, you were the one. I said, I was the lesson. She stepped back and said, congratulations. I said, thank you. She left quietly. I didn't look back. My wife asked, are you okay? I said, I'm complete. She said, good. I took her hand. At the table, Mark said, no drama. I said, no need. He said, that's power. I nodded. Later, my wife said, you didn't flinch. I said, I didn't need to. She asked, do you regret anything? I said, only staying silent too long. She said, silence protected you eventually. I said, with you. We danced slowly. She whispered, you're here. I said, I'm nowhere else. That was true. I remembered the ring on the table long ago. I said, this feels earned. She said, because it is. I smiled. As the night settled, I said, I didn't win by revenge. She said, you won by choice. I said, I chose the one who chose me. She kissed my cheek. I looked around and said, this is enough. The world agreed. I thought about the man who hid. I felt nothing. I thought about the woman who left. I felt peace. I said, betrayal sharpened me. She said, love softened you. I said, both were necessary. She nodded. When we left, I said, tomorrow is ours. She said, every day is. I closed the door behind us and said, I'm home. She answered, we are. I rested my head and said, this is how it ends. She said, this is how it begins. I breathed deeply and said, I survived. She replied, you transformed. I smiled and said, I married the right woman. She said, you became the right man. I turned off the light and said, no shadows left. The silence was warm. I whispered, I chose love that stayed. Sleep came easily. I dreamed without fear.